Today we'll be talking about differences and things you need to consider when designing an app for both Android and iOS. My name is Thijs Suijten and I'm a mobile developer at Q42. I work on both Android and iOS, but I mostly work on Android. And of course I know iOS. Of course I know iOS, but I'm more familiar with Android because I own an Android phone personally. So what I did in preparation for this talk is I tossed my Android phone aside for 2 weeks and used an iPhone as my primary device to really get to know the details and things I stumbled upon while using it. Alright, so you know a little bit about me. I want to know a little bit about you. Who of you is a designer? Who of you designers own an Android phone? That's pretty nice. But I think it's safe to say that in general, most designers use an iPhone, so most designers are more familiar with iOS. And that's something you need to take into consideration. So let's take a quick look back. This is how iOS used to look like. It had a really skeuomorphic approach, which basically means that they used real-life objects in their design. For example, the newsstand app used a real-life newsstand. And they did this because they thought people would find it easier to understand. In Android, you basically saw the same pattern. You saw it in icons, for example, the market icon, which is your shopping bag, or calendar or notebook apps, which represent a real logo. Luckily, Google and Apple came to the senses, and Apple introduced flat design, which, as the name says, is really flat design, which lets you create modern and much more cleaner apps. And Google introduced material design, which is also a very flat design, but it has a little bit more depth in it because they have concept of sheets of material, which have a position in the depth field. So users can see how objects relate to each other. Let's start at the beginning. How users launch your app. Both platforms have specific app icon design guidelines. So it's really good to read those. And as you can see here, Slack did a really good job. For Android, they just used their real icon. And for iOS, they went with a different design, which really fits well with the iOS guidelines. For the Messenger app, the difference is a little bit more subtle. For iOS, they just put a white background behind it, but also, if you look closely, the lightning bolt arrow on Android has a little shadow, which is in line with material design, and in iOS they don't have the shadow. Since we're talking about icons, if you're going to use icons in your app, then again, both platforms have a different style. So in Android you can use material icons. iOS in general has a lighter icon touch to it. And they also use different icons for different things. So if you're going to use a share action, then Android has the 3 arrow circles, and iOS has the square with the arrow. So that's something you need to think about. Also, each platform has their own set of components. And usually it's not a very good idea to deviate from those components. So, as you can see here, alert boxes and stuff, just use the components available in the OS. Although, sometimes for you as a designer, or maybe even for your client, some things on Android might feel strange if your client, for example, is also using an iPhone. For example, in Android, the actionable labels and text on buttons are all caps, which might feel a little bit weird for iPhone users, but Android users are used to that, and in that way they recognize what they can click. So just keep those patterns in play. Those were some simple examples of how you can adhere to the OS standards. But basically the biggest difference in your apps you can make with navigation. And you will be most likely, if you get it wrong, to frustrate your users. So it's really important to get that right. And we'll be talking about this some more, I guess. If you get it wrong, then people may feel trapped in your app, or they can't find the content that they're looking for. Looking at Android, the back button is a thing. It's real. On Android you have a navigation bar which contains 3 buttons, one for back, one for home, and one for switching apps. And they can look differently on different versions of Android. They can even look differently on different versions of like Samsung or LG versions of Android. And some phones have hardware back buttons. Mostly Samsung phones have hardware buttons. If we take a look at the main ways to navigate back in your app, then on Android we have an app bar, and on iOS we have a navigation bar, and of course we have the back button. And they do different things, and it's really good to understand what those ways of back navigation do. For example, on Android the back button on top of your screen means up navigation. So it takes you up in the hierarchy to a logical place in your app. In the contrary, the back button on the navigation bar works more like the back button on your browser. Users expect to go in reverse order from screen to screen which they visited. And on iOS, since we only have one back button, you need to think about, do I want to take my user back screen to screen, or is there some kind of up navigation style? One thing to note here is that the back button in Android and iOS both keep you inside the app, the navigation, and the back button on Android can take you across apps. So if you go into an app and you do back, you can go into a different app. Let's take a look at an example. In both stores, we're gonna find a book. Simple as that. One thing to see here is on Android we have the hamburger menu, which is pretty controversial. There are many blog posts out there saying don't use a hamburger menu, and even since that might be true, it's a very common pattern on Android, and you see it almost everywhere. And I think the hamburger menu is not necessarily an evil thing, just don't put any primary actions in there, because it's harder to find. So for example, we could go to the book section in the hamburger menu, but we're not going to do that. On Android, we're going to click on the entertainment tab. And on iOS, we're going to click on the categories tab. On Android, you see there's a book section as well there. So although it's in the hamburger menu, they also put it inside the entertainment tab as an alternative means of navigating to the book section. Now we're on the overview page of the books section. And what you can see here is that iOS has a back button, which takes you back to the overview. Android doesn't. If I want to go back to the overview screen in Android, I just use the back button on my navigation bar. Or I could go into the hamburger menu and choose a different category. Let's click on a book. So now we're on a detail screen of the book. And one thing to notice here is that, again, iOS has a back button. In this case, Android has as well, which takes you up to the navigation hierarchy, back to the overview. iOS basically does the same thing, but you can see here a subtle difference is that on iOS it's a very common pattern to put a label aside your back button, which tells you where you're going to. On Android you never see this. It's very common to put the title of the screen you're looking at in the app bar, but never the label of the back button. Aside from differences in navigation, there's also a difference in animation styles in both OSs. So let's take a look at the same example again. Let's see how the flow looks like on Android. Navigate to the top, entertainment, click on books, things come sliding in. I click on a book, there's a nice transition, the image, It shows you where you go to. I go back, nice transition again, which transitions the image of the book. And I can go back with my back button, and you see all the screens in reverse order, and then I'm back where I started. Let's look at the same thing on iOS. So I click on the categories, I go into the book section, I can click on a book, takes me to the book screen, I can go back. And this is a more traditional style of animations they went for here. And on iOS you can also navigate back by swiping with the thumb from left to right. So that's why this animation, the screens coming in from the right, makes sense, because if you go back, it feels very natural. So on iOS it wouldn't make sense in this case to implement a material style animation. Also on both platforms there are patterns to solve tasks the user wanted. For example, selecting or modifying items in a list. And it's really important to, again, use the patterns of each OS accordingly, because otherwise your users might get frustrated. One thing I noticed when using the iPhone, I was long pressing on things all the time, which is not a common pattern on iOS, but it is on Android. So when it was late at night and I wanted to change my alarm clock, it looked like this. Okay, it didn't take me too long to realize that I just needed to tap the change button, and then I go into some kind of edit mode where I can change my calendar or remove alarm clocks. But I wasn't used to that pattern, so there was a moment of frustration for me. So let's take a look at the same example. Let's delete some items from my spam folder here. On Android, I can long press on an item, which takes me to selection state. I can select a couple more emails and delete them. Or I can press the back button if I have a selection to cancel the selection. On iOS, I click the change button, which brings me again, like the alarm interface, brings me to edit mode. I can select things, I can share things, or delete things, or I can cancel that edit mode. So again, you see here different patterns, which are very common for Android and iOS users, but different to implement. All right, let's take a look at some more examples here of popular apps and see what the differences are. Starting with the LinkedIn app. LinkedIn app used to be a horrible app, but it's actually pretty good nowadays. So if you compare those, on the left Android, on the right iOS, well, they pretty much look the same. What you can see here is that both for both platforms implemented the design guidelines really well. On Android, you have material design, which has a little bit more depth, so you can see the shadow underneath the cars. You can see the shadow underneath the app bar. And we have the FOB button, the floating action button on Android to share new content, which is a really common pattern on Android. And if you take a look at iOS, then you have the top bar at the bottom, which again for iOS is a really common pattern. And you see that they implemented flat design. Again, we have cars, but without the shadow. We have some kind of, we have the top bar, but there's no shadow. And if you want to share something, then I have to click on top to share an article or whatever. The tiny detail here to notice here is that the ellipsis icon on Android, we also call it the kebab menu, is 3 circles above each other. And the same thing on iOS is 3 dots side. So LinkedIn got it right in implementing both platform styles accordingly. So if you go into the messages section, and let's say I want to delete something or whatever, again, they implemented both patterns. On Android, I can long press on an item, which shows me an alert dialog saying, okay, I want to delete this or ignore it. On iOS, they implemented swipe, so I can swipe a row, then there's an action there. So different design, more common to the OS. In this case, you might argue that for the LinkedIn app, they should have added a change button right here, because that's the common pattern if you want to change a list in iOS. So the swipe action is nice, but I think they also should have implemented change action. Next up, Spotify. Again, apps look pretty similar. Tiny detail again. These things on iOS, it's a common pattern to put an arrow next to a clickable Chrome item. On Android, you don't. So they got that right. As you can see, Spotify has a hamburger menu, which allows me as Android user to go to search and home. And personally, I think search and home and browse are primary actions. So in this case, I think that the Spotify app for Android has a poor design, because if I want to search something, I need to click twice, whilst in iOS I can just tap on search in the bottom bar. So in my opinion, this is a bad example of using the hamburger menu. This is the detail screen of the Slack app, in which I clicked on an image, and there are a lot of subtle differences here. iOS has a close button, Android doesn't, because you don't need it, because Android has a back button. So they really got this screen right. For Android, they put these action buttons on top in the app bar, where you would expect them on Android, and again, you see the ellipsis icon implemented correctly. Also for iOS, they added a gesture, because when you're operating your phone with one hand, the cross on the right top is pretty hard to reach. So you can also dismiss it by swiping it down, and then it's gone. So they really thought about that. Last example, the gallery apps on both platforms. This is the Photos app. They pretty much look the same again. What you see here is a bottom web bar on Android. It's a thing. You can use it now. It's a pattern in material design guidelines. And let's just take a look what it looks like if I want to go into the details of a picture, a large version. You can just click on it. There's a nice transition. If I go back, transition back. You can select another picture, and here they also implemented the gesture, so I can swipe it down on Android to dismiss it. And again, I can long press on an image, which brings me to the selection state, and I can share it or delete it or whatever. On iOS, I can again click on an image, which gives me a nice transition, very similar to Android. And also, they built in the gesture for dismissing the image by swiping it down. If I want to select it, some images, I need to go to the select on the top right, which brings me into the selection state and lets me share or delete images. While looking at these two apps, they're very, very similar. And like I said, the bottom bar is a pattern on Android, and it's basically up to you to decide if you can use it in your app. Because yes, it's a pattern, but it doesn't mean you can use it everywhere for the sake of consistency. Because the top bar on Android is still a more common pattern. So it's up to you to find out if your users are happy with it. One thing to notice here is that what felt a little bit weird for me, when I click on this, I go back to sets, I can click on it again, which kind of zooms out. And I, as an Android user, expected some kind of back functionality. So I go into the app and I can keep clicking that, and I want to go back to my home screen. It's just a little different style of what I expected from the back application. To sum up, with material design and flat design, I think apps look very similar, but you need to pay attention to those little details to make your app really feel true to the platform. And read the documentation. Sounds pretty boring. But for iOS you have the human interface guidelines, for Android you have the material design guidelines. And especially the material design guidelines are fantastic. There are loads and loads of examples in there, do's and don'ts, examples of how you can navigate in your app. They're really great to read. And last but not least, I think you as designers should be familiar with both platforms. And really familiar. So if you're an iPhone user, don't just have an Android lying in work and just use it once in a while for 5 minutes, but really use it. Because that's the only way you can find out what those differences are and what makes a great Android or what makes a great iOS app. Thanks.